All right, thanks. Well, thanks for having me back, for a third week. I guess after one or two, I could just get an email that says that these were canceled. So it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to talk to you again today about a subject that I really love talking about. One of the things that's evolved in my own way of thinking through the course of even talking this again, and I've been talking about these subjects broadly for a couple decades, but in talking to you this time, understanding how some of these principles really apply not only to leadership and healthcare leadership, which has been my business for the last decade or two, but also and in addition to all those areas of our lives, and we'll talk about that, but also how it applies clinically to a lot of the work that we're doing, and how we can take these same lessons and apply them very broadly to individual experiences. Even medical school, it's given me pause to think back to a lot of the experiences I had as a medical student, which were largely good. Funny, my wife doesn't remember them that way, but I do. They were largely good. And I think that there are principles we're talking about that I wish I had been more cognizant of at that point. So we'll go through the beginning sort of rather quickly. I'll remind you that there is a blog site that I put a lot of this material on. It's non-commercial. I don't think there's any advertisements on it. It's really just a reference for those of you who might be interested to do some more reading. There's a leadership list that I've got to update. I have a couple of more books on it. The pandemic has been hard on my ability to blog regularly, but I'm hoping to get back into that. And I'll also mention that the PDF that came out has a couple of links on it. I've tried to test as many of them as I can. I came up on a little glitch today that sometimes moving back and forth between browsers is a problem. Some of these documents are hung in the Google Drive. So anyway, this is just a reference source for you. I'll also go very quickly. I think it's always important to understand the biases of your speakers. And so here's my bias. I spent 30 years in the military, single payer system. I have a very biased view on the delivery of healthcare. And in that setting, I was a pediatrician, a pediatric pulmonologist. I ran a peds intensive care unit, went away to the war, came back, and really functioned in leadership roles as chief medical officer, chief operational officer, chief executive officer a couple of times, retired from the military, and came into this, what we would call the civilian job in my last life. In the interim there, I spent a couple of, a month or two helping to take care of patients with Ebola. Some of the lessons that I learned in leadership will come from that experience. I've mentioned to you all that I'm in Baltimore now, where I'm doing population health for the University of Maryland Medical Center. Very privileged to be a part of this wonderful team. And also some of these lessons come from the last 3 years, where I had the privilege of meeting your host, but also helping to lead the city and the state's effort around COVID, particularly as it applies to the Baltimore City response. Those are biases. Here's some assumptions. And I've said this before, leadership experts aren't. We are all students. I am still a student. I'm learning all the time through reading, through discussion, through application, and then reflection on those applications. I mentioned that leadership is life at the beginning. The principles we learn through leadership apply to lots of other relationships. And I can't tell you, I have children that are entering their 5th decade of life. Boy, that's hard for me to say. My wife and I have been together for over 4 decades. And the lessons I have learned as a leader have applied back to that. Now I'm applying some of those same principles to my relationship with my grandchildren. And I feel like I'm doing a better job than I probably did with previous generation. And then the idea that leadership is a fundamental process of a number of different things. It's not all nature. It's not all the way you were raised. It's not all the way you were born. It's a combination of that plus stepping forward when opportunity provides itself. And it will provide itself. They'll be looking for some volunteer to do something, and you'll think to yourself that could be a developmental opportunity, but I'm afraid to fail. Leaders step forward, clinicians step forward, the people that go on to really set an example in healthcare step forward. And so it's a combination of those 3 things together. You don't need to have a position to be looked up to as an example, even on the ward. You are the medical student that on the NICU or nursery rotation rebundles the baby after you do the physical exam in the morning. It is a small thing, but you just communicated to the nurses that their time matters to you. You don't have a position, you're a medical student, but you just communicated an important thing to them. I will tell you, you will be in codes and you will watch people walk away from the code, and they will be a code that doesn't turn out well, and someone is left to clean that room up. That's a leadership opportunity in my mind, because a lot of very important conversations take place in that setting, and you may have that occasion. Okay, you don't have to be the boss to be a leader. In fact, it's better that you don't see yourself that way, whether it's in a healthcare thing, a healthcare system. If you ever find yourself having to say, remember, I'm the one that's in charge, you can count on the fact that you've already lost the game, or you're losing the game. And that's whether you're in a healthcare system, a healthcare team, you're the resident on a healthcare team. You have to be the kind of person people want to follow, and that's largely a matter of example. Anyway, why me? We went through this. Why me is because you are in a profession that people look up to, and we talked about all of the graphs, and all of the data says the same thing. In the United States in 2023, if you want to look to the people we trust, it's going to be medical professionals. And again, everybody takes their ups and downs, but I will tell that the top of these scales have been medicine for a long time. We mentioned this, we won't go through it. We are handing you, my generation, are handing you a healthcare system that needs help. And I've had the privilege of meeting a couple of medical students in the last period of time that are determined through their degree to make a difference there. And that inspires me. We have a healthcare system that is great once you get in, but to the people outside, it looks a little like this. It's a solid wall with kind of broken windows that are tough to get through. People want access, convenience, and excellence. They want information, insight, and intervention, and it is hard sometimes to get through that wall. We also talked about this evolution of redefining healthcare teams. These are all reasons why we have to rethink what it means to be a physician or a medical student, a resident, and a fellow in these settings. I mentioned this quote before, and I'll come back to it again. Duce tempus est, or duce tempus eget, and we'll come back to that at the very end. So how do we do this? We talked a little bit about healthcare leaders are developed. This is a work that came out about a decade ago. It zooms in on how leadership and how clinical leadership is developed. And we looked at these things, and we made the point that 70% of our development, and I would say as clinical leaders, falls into having done hard things. You're willing to take the extra shift. You're willing to take on the extra responsibility. 20% of it comes from getting feedback, and you'll be the ones in that setting someday soon. You'll be the second or third year resident. You'll be the second or third year medical student, with the new first year or second year doing their first clinical rotations. Providing feedback is helpful. And then obviously there's self-development in what we used to call, when I was a medical student, the soft skills. And all of us wanted, to put in lines, and all of us wanted to start A lines and drop NG tubes and all that stuff. But what really mattered as a primary care doctor, which I did for 3 years, and then as a specialty doctor, which I've been coming up on 30 or 40 years since I finished my fellowship, has been those opportunities to develop those what we call soft skills, and kind of dozed off or looked the other way when they're being taught. I mentioned that all models are wrong, but some are useful. We've developed a model that we think is helpful, and it has these 4 C's, and it brings us up today to context. But we talked about character, we talked about competence, and we talked about this competence idea as being the second of those things. For those of you that did the homework, I wish we were in a small group. Competence is leading others. And we talked about an example I've used for several years because I think it's so good. It's from a fictional movie. Gettysburg was based on a book called The Killer Angels. It was a favorite of the folks that put this script together. And there's a scene in that movie where one general, General Lee, admonishes another general for not having done the right set of things. And that encounter is a very valuable interaction in terms of what healthy feedback looks like. And we don't really have time today to go through the details on that, but I would ask you, if you haven't looked at that, look at it and notice several things. And if you're writing notes, you can write notes if you want. Notice where people are standing. Notice what people are wearing. Notice where people are looking, and specifically where they're focused. Look what happens after a negative statement is given, and how that negative statement is softened by positive gestures and positive motions. Watch for physical touch. Watch for words of encouragement. Watch for promises of privacy, and watch how the whole thing terminates. And I'll tell you not to tell you the end before the beginning, but this general that was scolded by General Lee went on to become a pivotal part of his command, and actually subsequent to this gave his life for a cause that he believed in, inspired by that leader in that encounter. The encounter is fiction. It's from a fictional encounter, but we do know that the actual encounter took place. Something happened in that room, and something affected this General Stewart's behavior. So take a look at that if you get the chance. So here we are in the model. We talked about character 1 week. Last week, we talked about competence. This isn't your competence as a gastroenterologist. This isn't your competence as an ENT surgeon. This is your competence in your ability to inspire other people to do things that need to be done. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the context where you work. And then next week, we'll talk a little bit about communication. It won't be next week, it'll be a few weeks from now, but on the next of these series. I want to say that I'm going to use examples and context from my own experience over the last several decades and try and very pointedly apply it to where I remember that you all might be as students entering into the medical profession. It may or may not directly apply, so use your own application as you hear kind of some of the things that we're talking about. And this idea of context is the recognition that one of the mistakes we make as clinicians, as students, as residents, as fellows, is we always do best what we did in the setting that we left because we were good at it and we don't want to give it up. And so we'll come back to that theme over and over again, that one of the intentional and attentional things we do is focus on the new context that we're in. We're going to focus on three things. Pietas means to lead work or to be dedicated. It's knowing what needs to be done and knowing why you're doing it. And that's really understanding. We're going to look a little bit at culture. We'll talk a little bit about how climate is shaped. And then we'll talk about models of change. You're going to jump into healthcare practices, healthcare settings, hospitals, and you're going to be very focused on learning your craft. But step back periodically and ask yourself where the organization is, because part of what you'll be picking up is what's being laid down by that overarching set of culture, climate, and change. Now, I mentioned to you my background's in the military. I started in the Army. I didn't get into medical school right away. Happy to talk to anybody about that, but felt like I really wanted to be a physician. In the interim, having been ROTC, they found another job for me to do. And so I went off and did that, many years ago. Years later, having been in the Army way longer than I intended to be, I thought I would do my 3 or 4 years that I paid for through medical school and get back out. I found myself in a senior position in a Navy hospital as an Army officer. And I like to joke that they found something for me to do. This was actually a staff dinner we were preparing. But part of what's demonstrated here is the willingness to kind of do what it takes to get where you want to go. And then when you get there, the willingness to do what it takes to get whatever needs to be done. I think that successful clinicians and successful clinical leaders are willing to do things. There's no job that's, quote, below us. There are jobs that aren't the best use of our skill set. And we can do those until they can find someone else to do it. But remember the significance of lending a hand to a harried nursing professional or a harried technician or someone who's pushing a bed down the hallway. That establishes not only you as a leader, but you as a compassionate clinician as well. Now, one of the contexts I want to make is that contrast between these two cultures. And I grew up in a military culture. It's really what I knew. It spills back out periodically in my conversations. And I found myself in the middle of a merger about a decade ago, where I was the chief operating officer of a 2.5 million square foot hospital. It was 300 or 400 bed hospital, a number of clinics, about 7,000 people worked across the campus, and very high volume clinics. I found myself kind of caught between these two worlds, working for a Navy organization, but having come from a deep Army culture. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those lessons. For those of you who like movie clips, I often will use movie clips in these settings. There's a movie from 1995 called Crimson Tide. It's about a Navy submarine, but this particular clip speaks to Navy culture. It speaks to the authority. Gene Hackman is Captain Frank Ramsey. the authority of the ship captain at sea, and that's his role here. Denzel Washington is his XO, the role I held at the Navy hospital. He is the submarine XO, the second in command. And you can watch in this sequence some of the principles of what it means to be in a Navy culture, where the captain of the ship is way up here and everyone else is significantly below that. To contrast that, this is Mel Gibson as Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. It's a Vietnam era set piece about one of the first big U.S. Army excursions into Vietnam. And this is a very different approach to leadership. It's a very different approach to talking to your soldiers or sailors, and it speaks volumes about the culture. The reason I use these as an example is partly because it's my past history, but also because we should be tuned in to the culture of wherever we work. And that'll be one of the themes that we talk about as we go through this. And the contrast between these two things should make us think a little bit about the department we work for, the organization where we're doing our residency, the school where we're getting our medical education. It should talk about it. I have unit and service because from a military standpoint, the group that we're a part of, but you can ask the same questions about your professional organization. For years, I was an active member of the American Thoracic Society. I've kind of pulled back on that since I've been doing more leadership things. I'm still a fellow in the American Academy of Pediatrics, and that is my unit. It's my service. I'm a pediatrician in the middle of a sea of clinicians that are shock trauma doctors and surgeons and internists and infectious disease doctors. How do I relate to them, knowing my own culture as a pediatrician, both generalist and specialist, and knowing a little bit because of these roles about theirs? It leads to a body of literature that I found accidentally in a book by Malcolm Gladwell. Gert Hofstede was a researcher that found himself with a treasure trove of data. He found himself as a young PhD student being given a room full of file cabinets. And in those file cabinets were tests that had been taken by new employees of IBM, if I remember this correctly. And those new employees came from all over the world, but they were the same standard tests. And his job was to sort of figure out what to do with all this. We don't know what to do with all this. Well, he saw an opportunity and he began to look at these files with a research mind. He digitized them all, computerized them all. And as he began to observe some of the responses to some of the questions from different countries in different parts of the world, he began to develop a system of thinking around what he called these cultural landmarks, these cultural markers about different parts of the world. He began to look at individualism versus collectivism, cultures that are more masculine, sort of toughness versus those that are what he called more feminine. Again, these are a little older words, but they were a little bit more compassionate and empathetic. And he began to notice patterns, national patterns, and then regional patterns around that. And it became, in my mind, another useful model. Remember, all models are wrong, but some are useful, and these are useful models. It doesn't mean that they're complete. In fact, they are almost by definition inaccurate. Often we find models too that are dated a little bit in their language, and we have to sift through that and decide what might be valuable in them as we go through. And this was a very helpful model for me, having been the chief medical officer of the old Walter Reed, they called it. They closed in 2011. And the first executive officer, chief of staff of the new Joint Medical Center, as the two came together and merged right around 2011. It wasn't a decision that the organizations made. It was made for them by Congress, as the Congress periodically decreases the size of military posts. And the one that was on the list was the 114-acre campus for the old Walter Reed, here pictured on the right, that was closed and has subsequently closed. The building you see in the background there has been demolished. And now they are building, mixed income housing on the area where I did my residency and then served as chief medical officer. And it really speaks a little bit to these contrasting cultures, which we'll see. Let's start by talking chain of command very quickly, because you're going to find this in different groups. You're going to walk onto a service and you're going to see Bob Parker. He's the young attending that comes on, and you're going to say, because your sister knew him and your sister knew him when she went through medical school, you're going to say, hey, Bob, how are you? And he'll kind of quietly say to you, or maybe not quietly say, it's Dr. Parker. You have to call me Dr. Parker. I had a medical student when I was the chief of the department in the military who would call me by my first name, and I had to take her aside and say, you got to call me Dr. Callahan, or as it was, Colonel Callahan. This is the military. It doesn't work that way. And that was actually hard for me to reverse when I got out of the military. But you'll find some services that are like that. The Navy is like that, very rank conscious. The people at the top and the people at the bottom are separated by a long distance, and they're comfortable with it. They had to be that way because the chief threat to a ship in the 18th century when it sailed across the horizon was mutiny. And the captain's word had to be law. On the battlefield, the Army battlefield, it's much more horizontal. Every person kind of learns each other's job. The uniform itself, I wish I had time to talk about it, has gotten to the point where rank is almost hard to see on the uniform. And as a result of that, it's a much more horizontal organization, much less concern about the top and the bottom. In the Navy, there are separate places to eat for the officers, the senior enlisted, and the enlisted. In the Army, everybody eats together. In fact, the expectation of a good Army officer is that everyone else eats first and then you eat. Very different cultures. Think to yourself, how would that play itself out? Well, it turns out Hofstede put forward this idea of a power distance index. It's the extent to which the less powerful members of an institution or an organization or a national culture or an ethnic culture expect and accept that power has an unequal distribution. The Navy is very comfortable with the power distance index. It has deep roots in the 18th century Navy and the 19th century Navy. The Army evolved a much different way of thinking. I mean, people would walk up to General Washington and address him and ask him questions, just like it was for me when I was in the military. I toured a Navy admiral one time, and I asked him whether he had town halls for his sailors. He said, yeah, we have town halls. I talk, they listen. That's the power distance index. And actually, if you're in the Navy, you get used to that. And so the second thing is the way we solve problems. And that has to do with operating on ships in the middle of the ocean versus operating on land. In a ship in the middle of the ocean, if something breaks, you have to fix it. You have no other choice. You need that piece of equipment. You can't get a replacement for it. If a tank breaks in the battlefield, you just pull it aside and get another. There's always more stuff. There's always more room to put it on the ship. The only thing you can improve, if you have a process to improve, are the procedures. On the battlefield, you just solve problems with people and stuff. So when the Army hospital at Walter Reed wanted to move to the Navy hospital, despite the fact that new equipment had been bought in the Navy hospital, Army people brought all their own stuff. We had pallets full of printers and pallets full of old computers, and they weren't necessary because all new stuff had been purchased. But it's just a different mindset operating on a battleship versus a battlefield. And again, you're going to find different institutional cultures are different. The Mayo Clinic is different than the Cleveland Clinic, which is different than the clinic down the street from you. Each one has a different standard, a different way that they approach things. Some are more procedure oriented, some are less procedure oriented. Hopefully, we're all becoming more procedure oriented over time, but some are well ahead of others. And you find out that people aren't using clinical practice guidelines, or they're not using clinical pathways for very common problems, and you'll be befuddled. Why aren't we doing those? Well, we don't believe in cookbook medicine. Well, we've been talking about cookbook medicine since the 90s, and it's not cookbook medicine, it's standard of care. And it's making sure that children with asthma get meter dose inhalers, making sure that patients with diabetes are on the right medications. That's not cookbook, that's standard of care. And if you don't use the cookbook, you end up making something that you don't recognize. So we've made a lot of progress with this, but you're going to notice this idea of the power distance index, and then the second one of the uncertainty avoidance index, the extent to which members of a culture organization feel threatened by ambiguity or uncertain situations. And in healthcare, we became entirely too comfortable with a low uncertainty avoidance index. Well, we'll give it a try. I mean, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. The physician that I know that got woken in the middle of the night by a call from the laboratory saying that that newborn that we just did the CBC on, his platelet count is 12,000. And he goes, it's probably a lab error, just repeat it in the morning. No, it wasn't a lab error. It was a baby that was in the early stages of sepsis, and we lost hours in taking care of that baby because we wrote it off as a lab error. That is a narrow uncertainty avoidance index, and it can characterize some practices. You just get used to it. These are the things for you to look like. So where does culture come from? This is a separate model. Remember what I said, all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? I would call this 3P, but you can look at it in any number of different ways. If you want to look at any organization or any group or any team or any medical team that's working, you can sort of focus on the mind of it, the way we think about things, the heart, that is the way we feel about things, and then finally, sort of the physical part of it, how it looks, how it appears. And as you apply this to organizations, we are talking about processes, people, and then the place, the physical parts of the whole thing. And you can think about hospitals you've been in, you can think about clinics you've been in. They'll have different feels to them. They'll have different approaches to the same exact problem. And you'll see these kind of three things swirl together. Well, in my way of thinking, the very center of this is the culture of the organization. It's the place where the people and the processes and the physical plant, the place, the things they use, the way that they all come together. That's how you can define culture in a way. You'll hear the phrase, it's the way we do things around here. As medical students and as trainees, it'll be very important for you to figure that out pretty early. What is it that you're going to be expected to do versus what is it that the nurses are going to be expected to do? And as you move through your careers, you'll make that same jump each time you get to a new place. And here's what you won't do. What you won't do is what you hear people do all the time. And that is, when you get to the new place, you say, well, at Walter Reed, they did this. Or at Walter Reed, they did that. Or at the Mayo, they did this. Or I trained at the Cleveland Clinic and they did that. People will get tired of that about twice, and then you'll hear about it. But in the meantime, they're beginning to discount you as a clinician and everything else. So a caution there to remember that each place has its own unique culture. There are bad cultures. They're generally a reflection of bad clinical leadership, candidly, to be very transparent. But they're not generally bad cultures. They're mostly different. And if you feel uncomfortable, it's largely because it's not something that you're familiar with. That's really the soul of an organization. But the soul is an internal thing, and we kind of keep it to ourselves. The climate of the organization is the spirit of it, and that's what people will perceive. I had a patient who came into one of the hospitals I was responsible for at one point, and sent me a note to say, as soon as you walk through the door, you can just feel that there's something different. That's the climate that they were feeling. They could sense that there was something different. Well, we focused on specific things. We talked about having members of the team make eye contact with people in the hallway. And if they look the least bit like they might be lost, offering them to help. One complaint I got was, if one more person asks me if they can help me, I'm going to scream. Well, I kind of took that with a grain of salt because I thought, well, that's exactly what I'm asking them to do. Well, what does that mean in practical terms? It means you can't walk down the hall holding your cell phone. You can't be doing this while you're walking. I need people to make eye contact and look around. That's the climate that we're after. And if you stop and pull back from this for a minute, you'll be able to help set the climate of whatever team that you're on, team of medical students, team working on a project together, a study team, a study group. That climate is shaped by the people that are in there. And the person that is paying attention and being intentional can often have significant influence on that. Now, this is not unique to the military, and I want to make sure that you know that. This is a wonderful book by the Mayo Clinic. I mean, things have changed over time. It's a little bit dated, but I've often referred to it. They talk about these same three things, basically, but he uses, Barry and Stellman use humanic, functional, and mechanic for the same three broad ideas. Remember, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the other part of it is that truth finds a way in lots of different settings. So this is a useful model. He talks about the way the Mayo culture is built. The needs of the patient come first. Those 7 words are on everyone's lips, whether it's somebody in environmental services, whether it's a doctor, whether it's the CEO. The needs of the patient come first. There's a story in the book, I think, of an 18-wheeler that pulled up to the emergency room, and a guy stumbled out of it in the middle of a heart attack. And they were able, they were able to stabilize him, get him oxygen, get him morphine in those days, I guess, and get him all the right medicines on board. He stabilized, but he had to be hospitalized. And he looked at the staff and said, his truck is sitting outside the emergency room idling, and his dog is in the cab. Well, the people in the Mayo Clinic kind of sent the word out, found somebody with a CDL to drive the truck to one of the secure lots of the hospital, and another Mayo Hospital staff member befriended the dog, took him home, and took care of him until that patient was out of the hospital. One of my nurses, a labor and delivery nurse whose first name happened to be Christmas, took care of a family. When I say mine, she was in my hospital, I meant. She took care of a family over the Christmas weekend, and she found out that they had just moved to the area, and then they hadn't even got a chance to unpack. When they went home from the hospital, there was a Christmas tree and gifts on their front porch waiting for them. And this is what the nurse had taken on herself to do. That's the way that a culture is shaped. And I obviously, as the hospital leader in that setting, made a big deal out of that, because that's the kind of people we want to be. Sorry for that little digression. So the way we shaped this, that was one hospital I was responsible for at the top, built in 1957, I think. And that's the hospital we moved into. And when we made that leap, this was kind of, over the last decade or so, when we made that leap into the new hospital, this was the model that we had. The processes were all patient and family-centered care. And that really should be our mantra. The place was this concept of evidence-based design. The physical plant reflects the culture of the organization. It's neat, it's tidy. There's not scuff marks. There's not trash in the elevators. There's not trash in the hallways. Evidence-based design also is new construction where you've got lots of nature, you've got lots of pictures of nature. It's a conversation we can have another time. This particular hospital for a while was the world's leading example of evidence-based design and LEED gold construction. And then finally, the place itself, this notion of a culture of excellence, trying to build that into the way that the place is organized. One of the ways we fostered this is by reward and recognition. I carried a pack of cards like this in my pocket, and when I saw somebody do something I really admired, I would say thank you on that and give them one of these, and they became sort of collector's items. And I'm sure I got that from somebody else, but it was a helpful tool to kind of help shape this. And then this idea of people, practice, place is the way I sort of organize my thoughts. So you're a new resident, you're the chief resident, you're running things. How are we going to organize things? And I would just prioritize things using this and keep track of where our different priorities list and so forth was. Culture is shaped by a number of things. And again, we won't spend a lot of time on this. The logo is the visible identity. And there's a logo of the hospital, the Walter Reed Hospital I was a part of. The Mayo Clinic logo in the bottom right is the most recognized healthcare logo on the planet for what it stands for. The three shields represent clinical, education, and research. And I put on the left side, those little things that I took a picture of in an actual hospital, those are markers of culture. That's trash in the hallway. That's trash in an elevator. That's trash in a common area that nobody really owns. And it's telling you something about the organization. We set up the identity of the organization has to do with what all of the products look like, including the standard of professional excellence that the staff members of the hospital I was responsible for that year developed themselves. And then finally, the brand is all of this together. It's what it looks like, what it feels like. And if you stop and take a step back, in a large sense, when we get up in the morning and we dress for work, or we put on our bow ties, or we don't put on our bow ties, we put on a white coat, it's either clean or it's not, it's either ironed or it's not. We put on scrubs, they're stained or they're not stained, or they're stained after we come out of the operating room and we leave them on, kind of a little badge. We want people to go through the day and see how hard we're working. We leave our hats on, we leave our masks on, we leave our shoe covers on. We're all communicating something about our own personal brand and what that brand represents. When I was on call overnight, we almost never slept as residents. We didn't even have a call room my first year there. We would sleep on the couch if we could sleep at all in one of the adolescent waiting rooms. But I would get up early the next morning and take a shower and put my uniform back on, partly because or my clothes back on. I would be tricking myself into thinking I had been asleep. At work usually it's about 1 PM. After that, my body reminded me that you really didn't sleep at all last night. But the point is that I want this to be the way people see me. There's a level of professionalism. I have to tell myself that and other people myself. I'm going to tell you a secret. I put a tie on when I work at home. And I do it because, at my age and in my experience, it says something to myself about the seriousness of what I'm trying to do. You can make a cultural assessment of an organization. Here's a tool that is on the blog site if you're interested. I usually tell people, for example, you just got accepted to a residency program. You start in a week or 2 weeks. If it has the kind of place where you can get in, sometimes you can't get in, you have to be visiting somebody. But if you're not visiting somebody, or if they have that kind of policy where you can get in and you can just say to the front desk, well, I'm a new resident, I'm starting in a week or so, they may have an opportunity for you to get something. Or even if you've already oriented and you have your badge, but nobody knows who you are, you put on non-medical clothes and you move around the organization. You sit in waiting rooms, you listen, you look, you think, you watch. They don't know who you are yet, but you know who you are. You're about to become an intern or a resident in that hospital, and you want to get a feel for it. You want to understand what the culture is. Are people laughing? Are they laughing at each other? Are they laughing with each other? That's a positive sign. In a waiting room, how do people talk to patients in that waiting room? And again, you'll begin to get a sense of the culture. And especially if you're in a leadership position later in life, you're going to become a new department chair. These are ways you can kind of assess things. As you move from each level, as you move from being a college student to a medical student, as you move from being a medical student to an intern or a resident, as you get further along and you become a service chief and you're going to become the department chief, there's a great book by Michael Watkins that talks about these transitions and what you need to do in the first 90 days. And here's just a couple things: preparing yourself, accelerating the learning, putting what you used to do sort of behind you. And again, there's lots of resources out there, but recognize that these jumps are significant. And what we don't want to do is just assume that the new role we have is the same as the last one. This is what I did when I was a college student. This is what I'll do in a medical student. It's a whole new ball game. And I didn't really realize that until I kind of got into it. I probably have mentioned, but if I haven't, I'll tell you. I was an alternate. I got accepted to medical school 2 days before classes started, on the Friday before the Monday. So I guess that's 3 days. But before classes started, I was not mentally prepared for how hard it was going to be. I failed the first biochemistry test. The dean called me in to ask if I was going to be an academic challenge. I said to the dean, "Boy, I hope not." And it turned out I wasn't. I got used to it, but it required me to have to study 6 days a week. I probably mentioned this, but I'll say it again too, that because I was a newlywed, I purposed that I was going to take one 24-hour block out of every week completely off of study, and so that my then wife and I could continue to develop our own relationship together. And that was a worthwhile investment, both for my own mental health, that 1 day of rest out of 7, but also for our relationship long term. And the same thing, we had our first child after my second year of medical school. I don't really know why we were in such a hurry, but we're very thankful for the experience. I can tell you it made me a better pediatrician. So what does the culture look like? What does it feel like? Well, here are 3 outcomes that you see in a healthy climate reflected by a healthy culture. 1, people know why they're there. They have a shared reason. Now think about this too in your significant relationships, in your family, in the organizations you're in now. They are willing to share risk. There's nobody that says dirty diapers, not my job. Emptying the dishwasher, not my job. Drawing blood, holding for an LP, not my job. We share risk together. There's no job I'm going to ask you to do that I won't stand next to, even if I'm not good at it. When you get to be a hospital CMO, it means standing in the operating room and watching other people do surgery to the point where they say to you later, "You were always in the operating room." Well, I wasn't always in the operating room, but you saw me enough. And finally, a culture that tolerates disrespect is an unhealthy culture. One of my intensive care doctors once said to me when I was a department chair, it was just a dumb FP that didn't know what they're doing. And I took her aside after that and I said, "If you ever talk like that in front of the residents again, I'm going to call you out in public. You have no idea what those family medicine physicians, those professionals are going through in the office because you've never done it. But I did primary care for 3 years. I can tell you it's not as easy as you think when you're seeing patients 4 and 5 an hour. Shared respect means that we don't call each other names. We don't refer to each other in a derogatory way. And whether it's a relationship, a family, or an organization, that's what a healthy climate looks like. Shared reason, shared risk, and shared respect. The challenge that we have, and we'll get into change very quickly, is that you are in a field that is tactical primarily. You move from the exam room to the hospital bed, to the operating room, back to the hospital bed, back to the examination room or to the clinic. And each one of those is a tactical, interrupted encounter. And we don't take the time to think that there are bigger forces at work. I am changing. My relationships are changing. My relationships with my peers are changing. My organization is changing. I was totally oblivious to all of this largely early on. I think I felt like I was mostly surviving through most of medical school and most of residency. I was mostly surviving. But it wasn't until much later I realized that I had not developed any really good skills at thinking big picture. And so real quickly, leading change, I'm going to give you 4 quick examples. There, you're going to be in hospitals or group settings or so forth where there's unambiguous, explicit, direct categorical change. We're constantly developed in Joint Commission, the other standards. There are going to be times when there's a catastrophe happen, and I'll mention one here that had to do with the time that I was at the Army's Medical Center at Walter Reed. There's catalytic change when you know you're going from a smaller setting to a bigger setting. You know the organization, you're going to personally have to say, well, I was on ENT and we had 6 patients on there. Next week, next month, I'm on medicine and I'll have to take care of 12. You're going to have to change. You're going to have to think differently. And finally, there's cataclysmic change. And I'm going to hit a couple of examples from my own experience. This catastrophic change had to do when we were at Walter Reed with not keeping up with the fact that we had accumulated 400, 500, 600, 700, 800 soldiers in recovery on the same campus, and there were not the resources there to manage their care. The inpatient care was great. The outpatient care was great. The connection was weak between the two. I knew this when I got there in the summer of 2005, and I asked, how many students, or how many soldiers are here recovering? And nobody knew the exact number. You'd hear things like, well, it depends on how you count them. No. There's a bottom line. There's a number that says there's this many people here. That began, so this catastrophic change, it ended up on the front page of the Washington Post. We were there for 3 days. Everybody between me and President Bush got fired. And what we learned through that is that strategy abhors a vacuum. If strategic function is lacking, strategic effect is generated by the accumulation of tactical and operational outcomes. This applies to you as medical students. You're going to purpose in your heart to exercise regularly. You're going to purpose in your heart to eat well. You're going to purpose in your heart to put aside time for the ones you care about, your significant relationships, your partners, your husbands, your spouses, your wives, whatever, your nieces and nephews, your grandparents, your parents. And you're going to find yourself squeezed, overcome by tactical and operational outcomes. That's the time for you to keep revisiting the fact that you have to establish a personal strategy. The absence of a strategy is a strategy. It's just not the one that you necessarily want. When this catalytic change happened, I already talked a little bit about moving from the small hospital to the big hospital. We introduced this idea of a medical neighborhood, a primary care practice surrounded by specialty care. And it was a new way of thinking for a lot of people. But it was, I think it turned out to be a wonderful model. It's a separate whole discussion on its own way. I was just back there last week at this hospital. It was just renamed as the military sort of awakens to the fact that it had not treated all of its staff. It was just renamed the Alexander Augusta Military Medical Center. And that Dr. Alexander Augusta was the first Black or African American physician in the Army and the first internal medicine professor that was Black or African American in the United States. And so that hospital was just renamed for him. The point of all this is to say it's change. The cataclysmic change is taking this military operation in your bottom right screen and shoehorning it into this massive. And you can see the construction that took place in the National Naval Medical Center. That's on Wisconsin Avenue there in Bethesda. As the two hospitals sort of came together, I have whole talks about this as well. But it had to do with not really knowing who we were. This is just an example of trying to figure out the brands, who we are. Starting on the top left is the Navy, bottom left is the Army, the two of them coming together, and really not really clear on who it is we're trying to become, and the unwillingness to let go of symbols and icons. And those are some of the things that are here. The fight over where this statue of Major Walter Reed was going to go on the new campus when it moved to the Navy campus, and it never made it there while I was working there. It took a while after that, but it's the inability to tolerate changes and icons and the things that we value. It's the inability to make adjustments so that we kind of match each other, trying to come up with the appropriate Army office uniform to match what was the most common Navy uniform when we first started there. How do we dress? We did a survey one time that looked at what our patients would like us to wear. Was it the uniform? Was it the scrubs? Was it a white coat? Was it not a white coat? Now, honestly, increasingly, I mean, when I went through, an open collar was a little bit more unusual. You'd still see physicians with ties on. I wore a necktie all through my residency every day. And when I started when I wasn't scrubs, obviously I didn't wear it, but when I started at my new general pediatric job where I was for 3 years, the doctor walked up to me and said, "What are you wearing a tie for? Somebody's going to grab that and choke you to death, one of your kids." So I moved away from the necktie, but that's recognition about how culture works. And then ultimately, the leaders and the providers in the system have got to believe kind of in what they're doing and what they're trying to do. And that was a big part of what ultimately tied these two organizations together. It's what really shapes a culture ultimately. It's that deep down why. We're going to talk about that in communication and Simon Sinek's idea of what is it that shapes an organization. And for us at the new Walter Reed National Military Medical Centers, they all came together. It was this idea. It was the idea of caring for individuals like these by young leaders like the ones in the bottom right, who in the end were the reasons we were successful. These are young, they're young to me, everybody's young to me. These are the nurses, and you can tell by their pants, the blue is Navy, the green is Army, but there they are coming together, teasing each other during the annual Army-Navy game, but close enough to each other and obviously colleagues of each other. They gave me permission to use this picture. And it was because they were caring for these individuals who had really given up a lot to take care of our country. What we run into a lot of times, and you'll find this on different services, is a problem with rice bowls. We tend to focus on the rice. And here's what I mean by that. I get a call at night from one of the residents in the PICU. I ran a PICU for many years. And he said that the surgeons want to give this patient a blood transfusion. I said, really? I don't really think he needs a blood transfusion. Why don't you talk to the residents and call me back? And so he called me back a little while later and said, no, they're insisting on it. I don't think we should do it. And I said, well, why do they want to do it? Well, tissue healing, blah, blah, blah. And I said, all right, well, let's give them the blood transfusion. And he said, you're caving to them. I said, well, I mean, it's their patient too. I mean, we're co-managing the patient. I mean, and he couldn't see, and it wasn't so much that there wasn't the opportunity, the rice in the bowl. It was the idea that the residents were coming into his unit, his PICU, where he was the nighttime coverage. And it was the sound of the chopsticks in somebody else's bowl. Is that my patient or is that your patient? Why isn't it our patient? Why can't we figure out as grown adults how we can manage this together? Now, I get it. You're going to have clinical decisions where somebody has to be in charge. And I think we talked about that last week. When someone is coding or deteriorating, somebody has to be the bottom line. I just believe that that's true. But I will tell you, and I didn't tell you this last week, I ran a code in the ER one time for a baby that had just gotten off of an ambulance and coded as soon as they came in the door. And we're running the code, tiny baby, running the code. And it's not going well. He's not coming back. I checked. I did all this stuff. And a voice behind me says, my friend, look at the airway again. And I pull out the laryngoscope, and this time adjusted differently. And the tube had dislodged into the pharynx out of the larynx. And put the tube back in. Pediatrics is great this way. When you give babies oxygen, that's your #1 resuscitation drug. When you give them oxygen, they come right back. The point is that in that moment, and I turned around, I knew who it was. It was one of the senior surgeons, and he just walked away. But he was exactly right. That kind of collegiality, that I want the sound of the chopsticks. I mean, this isn't my rice bowl anymore. This is us sharing this responsibility together. So here's the bottom line real quickly. We talked about this. Bad leadership is common, but but intentionally bad leadership is rare. Bad medicine is unfortunately common, but intentionally bad medicine is rare. And that should be sobering to us. That's why we have to approach it with humility. That's why we have to be open to people's suggestions. Consistently good leadership, consistently good clinical leadership consistently good clinical care is something we do on purpose, something we focus on. It's something that we're not distracted while we're doing. We're not on TikTok while we're writing admission orders or whatever it happens to be. When leadership fails, and I would say in particular, when we're not operating correctly in whatever setting, it's usually something, it's a character flaw. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. It's a competence flaw. We're using the wrong setting, or it's a failure to recognize context. And that's our theme today. In other words, you're acting as though you're still a college student. You're a medical student now. These patients, I know you're not a doctor, and you know you're not a doctor, but they don't know you're not a doctor. I'm not asking you to do doctor things, but I am asking you to behave professionally as though you see yourself that way. That means when you're with patients or around patients or near patients, you're on stage. And that's perhaps different. When we could do different things when we were college students, we didn't have that responsibility. That's a recognition of that transition. When you're the chief resident, you're the chief resident. You're not one of the residents. You're going to have to tell somebody to pull an extra Friday shift. How's that going to go? If a minute ago you were drinking buddies, how are you going to moderate that? And that's kind of up to you all to think through and to moderate as you go through your own careers. Last things leadership experts aren't. So become a student. Leadership is life. Integrity is being consistently present and being consistent across that spectrum. And then finally, as we said, nature, nurture, and Knox. And the secret of success is for a person to be ready for their time when it comes. And that leads us to our final quote, Duce Tempus Eget, the times require a leader, and those times are now. I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you for your mentorship and teaching, Dr. Callahan. We'll now begin our Q&A session. And it's great to have you back again this week and learn more about context as an integral part of leadership practice. One question we do have is this. So you mentioned that you feel that your generation is passing down a healthcare system to future doctors that need to make changes to improve it, especially since the US is ranked 55th in the healthcare efficiency. We were curious to learn if you feel that there were any catalytic changes specifically you can discuss with us that may have improved or worsened the state of healthcare in the US, like the Affordable Care Act as an example.
I think that the way healthcare has evolved in the United States is challenging. It's unlike any other system in the world. It may be the best system in the world if you have the means to navigate it, but it's not the best system in the world for most of the people we have the privilege of caring for. We've got to move to a system where those individuals are provided the same level of access, the same ability to access care as everyone else. And I'm not really smart enough to know what that looks like, but I will say this, and I've probably said it here before, I think that we have as an example a number of international examples of single payer systems or more narrow payer systems like Taiwan. And we also have, and although I read a Harvard Business Review article now a few years back, things might have changed, but I mentioned there are national examples of systems that work relatively well. The VA and the VA and the DoD are both those kinds of systems. And so I think we have examples, and I think we have a lot of work to do to make it so that the standards apply to everyone, that everyone can access care. 30 to 40% of the neighbors in the neighborhood where I live have no access to a car. How are they going to go to their primary care doctor and then follow up with audiology, ENT, and get a CAT scan or an MRI of their tympanic bones? So those are the kinds of things we've got to figure out, I think.
As a short follow-up, because this wasn't initially in the questions, you did mention about how many people in your neighborhood don't have access to cars so that they can see a physician. Do you think either A, improving public transport in America, or B, making telemedicine more available for people will both help alleviate these issues?
Yeah, I think both will help. I mean, and in fact is that, I mean, we have a number of programs here at the medical center where we would put funding aside to provide lifts for patients to get back and forth. I mean, we've done that for many years now. I mean, 5 or 6 or 7, I've only been here 7 years, but I think there's lots of opportunities. Listen, I'm a huge believer in telehealth. There's so much that can be done with telehealth. And so I really advocate for that use. So that was a big area of our research, managing kids with asthma at home with telehealth. So there's a lot that falls into the bucket of your first question. These are the kinds of things that will improve access for everyone, because nowadays everybody's got a cell phone. I mean, and those are the means by with a lot of telehealth can be provided. A friend of mine sent me pictures of her child yesterday. I watched it for a while. I thought it was molluscum contagiosum on his chin. Then later I kind of wondered, gosh, the pictures weren't that great. Could this be herpes simplex type 1? Turns out it was impetigo. I wasn't in a position to see the child, but I knew that they probably needed to see care. That's access to me. And that really answers, I think, both of those questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that did answer both of our questions. We really appreciate you taking the time to mentor us today, because we only had 2 questions, and I look forward to part 4 of your series on June 23rd. I'd love for everyone to please give a warm thank you to Dr. Callahan in the chat box for this incredibly informative session. Thank you.
Thank you. Guys, have a great weekend. I hope everybody gets to spend time with the people that they love and care about. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Callahan. We will now conduct our closing session with our quiz and future session dates. So the quiz link is now live. You'll need a 70% or higher to pass and receive certification. Parts 1 and 2 of the series are also included for the Ducimus series as well. So you can still access all 3 sessions. So there'll be another one, and then we'll have this course sort of created for leadership. On our next slide, actually, we have a couple of leadership opportunities available now. On teleshadowing.com/leadership. So in case you're interested in joining our nonprofit executive board or leadership team, now that a lot of students, such as myself, are moving on to medical school, this is a unique opportunity. You get to work with our medical directors and kind of learn more about what goes on behind the scenes of what it takes to run this program. We've actually been running for about 2.5, 3 years now. So, I feel like you'll learn very well. We have a very dynamic team, and, we'd love to have you if you're interested and passionate. One small requirement we put in is that you complete the Ducimus series, because we use many of these lessons when, practicing this type of leadership, such as, keeping in mind our implicit biases and just all the amazing things that Dr. Callahan talked about. I feel are very important to be on the student exec board and team. We have a couple of different positions available. You can also see on our team website where you can see where the team members have these different positions. But really, it's a very dynamic role. You get to do more than just one thing, and, you do things beyond your job description. And that's what we're really looking for in the students who apply. We also have our outreach positions like state regional director open, campus ambassador, in case you want something that's a little less intense or a little less time consuming, because I know that we're all volunteers and we really expect your time. In case you're interested in volunteering or, being part of the team, feel free to apply now. Our deadlines will really be based on how many people apply and really based on openings. So feel free to get that. Let me link it in the chat box now. There we go. All right. And now moving on to our next session dates. So we'll actually be having a student panel next week, and as well as internal medicine. We'll talk more about ethics in medicine for those students who are thinking about taking the Casper exam or the AAMC preview, which are these ethics exams that different medical schools require. So it'll be a very interesting session because we'll be having students come in who've actually succeeded and performed very highly in these exams, and they'll be talking about some test taking strategies, which will be very helpful in case you're thinking about taking it later next month or so on. Yeah, and also, we'll be updating these on our Google Calendar. And yeah, so thank you very much for attending today's session. We hope to see you at upcoming sessions as well. And this concludes this week's shadowing. Thank you.